How many times a day do you stop what you're doing to check your phone? Or take what was supposed to be a minute-long break, but ends up being 20 to scroll through Facebook? What some may see as a way to decompress or stay on top of things may actually be lowering productivity and overall happiness. And it's a widespread issue. 85% of Americans today own a smartphone, according to Pew Research Center. This number is even higher at 96% in young people between 18 and 29 years old. The rise of smart devices has given way to endless information at our fingertips, but at what cost? Dr. Anna Lembke argues that this addiction to our smartphones and other devices is severely affecting happiness. Lembke is a professor and the medical director of addiction medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. She's also the author of Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. She says, like any other addiction, it's hard for people to pull away.
Texting, tweeting, gaming, gambling, sugar, shopping, social media posts, you name it. Everything has been drugified today, making us all hooked and not wanting to stop, even when we want to stop. And that's sort of the mysterious process of dopamine, is that it really has to do more with wanting and with motivation rather than with actual experiencing pleasure. We can be motivated to do something even when we don't really want to do that thing or like doing that thing. And I think most people can relate to that with digital products and with their smartphones, when we find ourselves clicking repeatedly and repeatedly, even though we're not that interested anymore, but we just can't stop because we're afraid of that feeling of falling away when we do.
Lembke explains that this strong urge is the result of a dopamine-deficient state. Dopamine, simply put, is a chemical in the brain that's tied to pleasure, motivation, and reward. When we have too much of a good thing, it throws off this fragile balance.
One of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, by which I mean that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like a balance. So if I eat a piece of chocolate, my balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure, and a little bit of dopamine is released in my brain's reward pathway. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or the side of pain. So no sooner have I eaten that piece of chocolate than my brain will work very hard to downregulate my own dopamine transmission and my own dopamine receptors. And it does this by tilting the balance an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's that moment of wanting a second piece of chocolate. Now, if I wait long enough, then the balance is restored and that impulse goes away. But if I don't wait and I continue to eat chocolate repeatedly, what happens is that I end up with so much weight, or in the book I talk about gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance, that I essentially change my set point for experiencing pleasure and pain, such that it's harder and harder for me to get pleasure from chocolate or anything else.
Many addicts start off using a substance or taking part in a behavior for pleasure or to solve a problem, but eventually continue doing so just to maintain some sense of normalcy. These days, Lembke says, millions of Americans are dealing with varying levels of addiction because these pleasures seem to be just about everywhere.
Even just 2 generations ago, it would be very unusual for a person to get addicted unless they had some of the typical risk factors for addiction. And risk factors include things like a biological parent or grandparent with addiction, childhood trauma, severe socioeconomic distress or social dislocation. But today, your life can basically be perfect and you can still get addicted. Why? Because we have so many dopaminergic substances and behaviors out there that are not just available to us, but that are actually following us around. So we get triggered all the time because these algorithms know what we like, know what we've clicked on before, and basically offer it up to us on a platter, even when we're trying to abstain or don't want to do that activity.
Screens are in our pockets, in our living rooms, part of our work. And this makes us more vulnerable to feeling like we can't be without them. Yet in many ways, these constant interruptions are setting us back.
If you're constantly reacting to your environment, you can't sort of be mentally still long enough to have an idea or to, gestate or experience or gestate or process an experience you just had. I'm often amazed at when I will sit down to try to do some more creative work, not 3 minutes into it, I'm wanting to check my email, right? It's like I'm interrupting. I get to a sort of a point of friction where I don't know quite what the answer is, or I have some anxiety because I'm not certain where the project is going to go. And so instead of letting myself just sit with it and tolerate it, I want to distract myself by checking my email or checking my device. And that's a real trap, because when we do that, we're just not able, again, to get through that distressing moment and come out the other side with a continuous thought. And there are ways we can combat this.
It's important to remember that addiction is not black and white. There are varying levels, and the first step is to identify that there's a problem. But in some ways, it's harder to pinpoint that you're hooked to a device because it's so socially acceptable to be connected 24/7.
As soon as we put our phone away or try to abstain for a period of time, we essentially experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, craving. And then we kind of tell ourselves, well, it's not that big a deal. I need it for my work. I need it to be connected to my kids. Who really cares if I use the phone again? And what I want to get people to see is that it really does impact their well-being.
To test this dependence on devices, Lembke encourages people to lock away their phones for a set period of time, like a day or a full weekend, and take note of how they feel.
When we abstain initially, what we'll experience is a lot of rationalizations in our minds for why it's so important for us to use again. And that's exactly what happens to people addicted to alcohol or drugs, all kinds of rationalizations why it's okay to use the drug again. But if we wait long enough and allow homeostasis to be restored, what we find is that we're not thinking that way anymore about the phone. We're more free to have other thoughts and engage in other activities, and we get away from that compulsive loop. Once we get away from the compulsive loop, then we're really able to look back and see true cause and effect, and then we're motivated. So we almost have to do abstinence in order to get motivated to moderate our use.
This break in the everyday cycle can be a breath of fresh air. Lembke has seen firsthand the renewed freedom people feel when they step back from their screens and live more in the present. The reality is that technology is a part of life these days, but it's possible to set strict boundaries and live within them.
Everybody's familiar with intermittent fasting with food, where you eat all of your food in an 8-hour period and you fast for a 16-hour period. I try to do that with Wi-Fi and with being online, and consolidate the time that I'm online to a very condensed amount, and then make sure that after that I turn it off and I don't go back on, because otherwise we get into this kind of like chronic sedentary checking, which is really not good for us and for our brains.
Lembke says that it can be difficult at first to be without your phone for even an hour or two. One helpful way to put the stimuli out of sight is to lock it away or hand it over to someone else.
In my book, I talk about 3 basic categories of self-binding. They are literal geographic barriers that we put between ourselves and our drug of choice, and that would be, for example, locking your phone in the kitchen safe, or at least putting it in a drawer at certain points in the day or the night. There are also chronological self-binding strategies, so where you say, I'm only going to use it certain times of the day or on certain days of the week. And then finally, categorical. That's where you try to avoid super potent forms. So for me, for example, I try really hard not to watch YouTube videos of Dr. Pimple Popper, because once I watch one, I cannot help myself. I have to watch 20 more. And I can't explain it to you, but that's true for me. So I have to avoid those potent formulations.
It can be all too easy to become dependent on a device. Soon enough, it feels like you're missing out if you're not checking it several times a day. But what's the true cost of this habit? The next time you're scrolling through social media or browsing the apps on your phone, think about if this pastime has turned into a problem. For more information on this topic, check out Dr. Anna Lembke's new book, Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, available online and in bookstores. To find out more about addictions and links to resources, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Cardiovascular or CV disease is the #1 killer of adults in the U.S., and millions of people trying to reduce their risk of a heart attack or stroke may unknowingly be taking medications that are not proven nor FDA approved to reduce cardiovascular risk. Let's hear from cardiologist Dr. John Osborne.
Many people are unaware that after a failed outcome study, the FDA revoked the approval of fenofibrates when added to statins, as the risk outweighed the benefits to heart health. It's important to remember that statins, along with diet and exercise, can lower cardiovascular risk by about 25 to 35%, but persistent cardiovascular risk, which can lead to a life-threatening event, may remain. I would tell anyone still being prescribed fenofibrates, such as Tricor and Trilipix, with a statin, to talk to their doctor about FDA-approved therapies for cardiovascular risk reduction.
To learn more and get clear on the facts, visit itscleartomenow.com. Again, that's itscleartomenow.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
Think about it for yourself. Think about a time that you were scared of something and someone told you, oh, that's nothing to worry about, just calm down. Did that make you feel better?
Probably not. We explore the art of how to successfully talk to children. Then,
we see this plane race past us, and I watched the plane aim and crash into the World Trade Center.
What were you doing the morning of September 11th, 2001? I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.